Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 3, First Language Development and Second Language Acquisition. Just before we get started, all the readings, a link to this PowerPoint, in addition to this video on First Language Development and a second one on Second Language Acquisition, are all going to be available, or all should be available on the Canvas site, as well as links to the discussion posts that follow the second part of this lecture. So I'm going to just jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to be showing a couple of videos. So I'm going to be tinkering with the technology a little bit as we go through, but it should be pretty straightforward. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you. Here we go. And right, so Module 3, First Language Development, Second Language Acquisition. Here we go. First language development. So a little pre-vocabulary. Much of this vocabulary will likely be familiar to you, the listener. But just as a review, these terms will be coming up not just in this module, but in subsequent modules, especially when we get into literacy. Morphology literally means the study of shape, but when applied linguistically, it's talking about words and how words are formed. So in the literature, morphology tends to take three different forms that are ordered in increasing complexity, at least in terms of language development. So the first one is inflectional, and that's when you're adding plural endings or past tense endings. For example, S to dog to get dogs, or ED to walk to get walked. This is sort of the first kinds of morphological patterning you start to see in young children's language use. From there, you get compound morphology, which is when you just put two root words together to get a new word. Tooth plus brush equals toothbrush. And the most complex is derivational morphology, which is affixation, prefixes and suffixes attached to root words. So D plus compose gets you decompose, popular plus ITY gets you popularity. You often hear the term morphosyntax. That's because in derivational morphology particularly, but also in inflectional, when you add prefixes or suffixes, you change the part of speech that the word represents, and you also change its meaning. The next one is phonology, which is just the sounds of a language. Being able to produce b, or t, and being able to manipulate those sounds. So if I say take the word cat and replace the k with a p, what word do you get? Pat. That requires nothing to see. It's just what you hear and the sounds that you produce. Vocabulary, this is the most straightforward one, obviously. When you hear the terms lexicon or lexical, that means vocabulary. And that's just words and word meanings on a very basic level. But related to vocabulary and our lexicon is semantics, and that's conceptual relations between words. So for example, dog, bark, furry, canine. Those are all independent vocabulary terms, but they are also semantically related to each other. So semantics and vocabulary go together. Semantics is the conceptual relations between words. From a teaching perspective, that can be very useful. You often see word clouds with a word in the middle and students generating related words, semantically related words. Syntax, grammar and mechanics of a language. As we'll get into later, most languages have syntax, and most languages contain nouns, verbs, objects, and order them in different ways. Subject, verb, object languages, verb, object, subject languages. Typically, the languages all have subjects, verbs, and objects. The syntax part, that's part of the syntax. The other part of the syntax is how they get ordered in oral language and in writing. Phonemics is related to phonology. That's when you are attaching letters to the sounds. So a B makes a B sound, and so that's sort of the basics of phonics instruction. and the foundation of reading and writing from a literacy perspective. And finally, orthography. From the foundations class, we talked about orthography. That's the way a language is written down. So English is written down using a Roman alphabet. So is Spanish. But Chinese is not written with an alphabet at all. It's a logography. It's logographic. And so English and Chinese do not share an orthography. They're orthographically distinct, whereas English and Spanish are orthographically similar. However, English has a lot of irregularities in its spellings and things like that, which makes it what's called an orthographically opaque language. That is, you have to memorize the word 8 as representing the number 8 shouldn't be written down that way. It does not correspond to the letters. And there's a lot of words like that, as we all know, in English. There are very few words like that in Spanish. So while English is an opaque orthography, Spanish is often considered a transparent orthography where the sound-symbol relationships are consistent and reliable. And thus it becomes easy to learn how to read words in Spanish. Kids learn that much easier than they learn to read words in English. It takes more time in English. Okay, that's the overview. I'm going to talk about 3 older but relevant language development theories for first language development, for basically monolingual language development. The first one comes from this guy. I'll give you a second to see if anyone can name this person. Yell out his name in your group if you're with your group, or yell it out loud if you're alone. Yes, you guessed it. That's B.F. Skinner. Now yell out to your group, what do you know about B.F. Skinner? What is he known for? Correct again, behaviorism. B.F. Skinner was one of the founding sort of fathers, if you will, of the behavioral movement in the 50s. And he founded much of his behavioral research on work with animals, particularly with pigeons. And sort of the stimulus response here is sort of you provide some kind of reward for a desired behavior. And that's sort of the foundation of learning, that you do something and you get rewarded for it. And so you do it again. And the more times you do it, the more likely you are to learn it, because you keep getting the reward, and with repetition, you learn through the reward system. So that's how he conducted many of his experiments with pigeons, claiming that they learned. And most of those experiments with pigeons would start with a paragraph, something like, X number of pigeons at 75% body weight were participants in this experiment, because what he would do would be to starve his pigeons so that they were ravenous and basically would do anything for food. And so then he would use the food as the reward and teach them to do things like navigate a maze or something like that. But there was this confound between the fact that he had starved them and was thus offering them food, and so yes, they're gonna do what they're asked to do because they're gonna do what they have to do to eat. Whether that constituted learning has come under consistent scrutiny. And so anyway, be that as it may, he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior in 1958, where he applied these principles of behaviorism to human language learning. And so the behavioral approach to this is, for example, a baby learns to say mama, identifying the baby's mother, by interacting with their mother, and they'll say m, and then we'll notice a response from the mother. The eyes light up with anticipation. And seeing that reward for saying ma, the baby says it again, ma, and then says ma and gets an even bigger reward because that's closer to mama. And so this goes on, and the baby eventually learns through this stimulus response mechanism that person is mama, because the baby has been appropriately rewarded enough times that the baby gets to saying mama. And that's the sort of underlying sort of mechanism for human language learning, is this behavioral approach. Hold that thought. Here's our next person. Who's that? Correct. Very good. That's Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky read verbal behavior as a young and upcoming cognitive theorist, and was, I think, I don't know his actual mindset, but if you read the review, the book review that he wrote, he was appalled by the idea of behaviorism accounting for the full range of human language acquisition. And so what he proposed was the following. He said, well, maybe there are behavioral dimensions to language learning, like the mama example is completely plausible. What is completely implausible is that theory of behaviorism would account, for example, for grammar learning, figuring out how to use the subjunctive tense. If my mother were not here, I would be sad. Children don't get rewarded for using the subjunctive tense by their parents, right? I mean, that's not the way language learning works, argued Noam Chomsky. What he argued and introduced to the linguistics world is that humans basically have a language instinct. There's something built into our cognitive architecture that, and it's evolutionary, that pushes us to develop language. It's in our brains to begin with, and then it just needs time to develop. And he says the best example of this is grammar. And he said, for example, we were talking about syntax before. Said if a Martian anthropologist came to Earth and studied all of the Earth's languages, that anthropologist would come to the conclusion that we all speak a single language comprised of consistent syntax, comprised of subjects, verbs, objects, adjectives, etc. They only differ in their surface features. And even though Mandarin and English are written down differently, they still have the same basic cognitive architecture undergirding them. And so the surface features are just relatively superfluous. It's really just language that's being spoken, and they're all consistent. So Noam Chomsky ushers this in his review of verbal behavior. It's worth noting that B.F. Skinner, I believe, did not write again after that. There may have been other factors involved, but that launched what was then called in the 60s and 70s the cognitive revolution. And this idea of universal grammar and deep structure got a very strong foothold in linguistics and in psychology. But then along came this person and a whole bunch of other people. But this is Catherine Snow. She's still a professor at the Harvard Grad School of Education right now. She came along around the time that universal grammar and deep structure was exploding, and she and her colleagues took issue with this idea of just a straight language instinct, this idea that perhaps humans would develop language even if they were living by themselves or living fearfully amongst wolves. She said, no, you have to have an interactionist perspective. That is, you only develop language by interacting with other people. There's no way that is not part of this equation. And Chomsky, you're leaving this out by spending a lot of time diagramming sentences to show consistency of syntax and grammar across languages. So rather than define the interactionist perspective for you, I'm going to show you a video that captures the interactionist perspective perfectly. So I'm going to have to switch screens, so bear with me for one moment.
I need to work on that, right?
Okay, now you should be able to see this one. This is a video of a dad with his son. His son does not yet speak English, but I think through the interactionist perspective, this boy has a real good chance at being a strong language user. some of you may have seen this video. Have a listen, and this video is the definition of interactionist perspective.
Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh, not this one. This is the finale of this one. Okay, so yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know when they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that in. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's like that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. He was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? Don't do it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right. I need to work on that.
Okay, so that is the interactionist perspective. You see complete conversational interaction. The father is pulling his son along linguistically, eye contact, engagement, verbal interactions, even though the baby doesn't really speak English. The baby does say no. But the point is that that's being modeled. That interactionist perspective is critical. If there is a language instinct, it's only as good as the interactions that develop it. And that was Catherine Snow's point. So monolingual developmental considerations, given those three theories, these are some typical developmental expectations derived from literature in North America and Europe. So this is not meant to suggest that this is the way all humans develop language. But if you look across traditional literature on language development that comes out of the North American tradition and the European tradition, these are the kind of benchmarks that you see. So 0 to 12 or 18 months, kids are being exposed to language in some way, shape, or form. This used to be called, in Catherine Snow's days, motherese. And I'm telling you this term not because I think you should use it, but it's a little bit of history and terminology that has since gone out of style. And now it's just sort of about linguistic exposure. It doesn't have its own term anymore because this suggests perhaps that only mothers are engaging linguistically with their children. But in this phase, like you saw in the video, you see things like pointing, eye contact, joint attention. That's when you share, viewing a certain thing, like the father and the son are sort of jointly attending to the television show, that sort of thing. Pointing at it and discussing it. Familiarity with the phonology of the L1, the first language. First of all, the baby in that video is becoming phonologically aware, is sort of using sounds to mimic language. But also, babies notice the phonology of the language that they're being exposed to. That is, when they hear a different language being spoken, they notice that it's not the same as the phonological patterns of the language to which they're being exposed at home. And again, babbling phonological experimentation is exactly what you see with the baby in the video. And then from 12 to 18 months to 2 years, you see emergent speaking, typically coming. First words, labeling, preliminary sentences. Again, there's broad range around this shorter band, 12 to 18 months to 2 years. Some babies will start talking before that, others after 2 years. My son, for example, didn't start talking until he was 4 years old. Imagine that, parents in the room. So there is great range around these developmental expectations. From 2 to 4 years, you start to see pretend play emerging amongst children. And one way linguists know that sort of language and thought are connected to each other, and that's part of the video that you watch, Lyra Bordovitsky, is that little kids, after they start talking and they're playing, tend to not know that you don't need to say everything you're thinking, but that is what they typically do. And people who are early childhood educators who have young children of their own will have seen this. And this external speech is what it's called. Looks a little something like this. And again, I'm going to switch screens, so bear with me 1 second. Okay, listen. So there you see the girl is playing with the bear, but she's sort of talking out loud things that she's thinking. She's speaking a language that is not English, so I don't know what she's saying, although she may have said bear. But she's talking out loud while she plays with the toy. And we see little kids doing this all the time, which shows this link between thinking and speaking, which is an important developmental milestone that in what you might consider typical development you see in children. Also during this time, grammar, vocabulary, syntax, pragmatics, all of these undergo massive growth. And Chomsky used to argue, here's another way you know that grammar is universal: when kids overgeneralize the use of irregular verbs. So kids don't know that the past tense of eat is ate. Their cognitive architecture says, oh, just put ed at the end of that. That's what my language does. So you get eated and runned. And so when kids are doing that to Chomsky's universal grammar argument suggests there is a universal grammar that's being applied broadly to given languages. And finally, at age 5 years and beyond, and this is contentious, not necessarily true, it's debated, but one school of thought is that by 5 to 6 years, the fundamentals of grammar, syntax, they have been set. That is, the foundation for continued growth over time has been set by ages 5 or 6. Educators often contest this, saying that you can't say that because you can't argue that the game is played by the time kids are 5. Otherwise, what's the point of education? So again, I don't know that I agree with this, but this is something that people say, that syntax, grammar, etc., the foundations of language are set, but growth continues without asymptote. So asymptote is a word that I learned recently. So I'll try to demonstrate what I mean by asymptote. So language development, here's age on the bottom, mastery, just say, is just some random scale of getting better at language. And these are years on the bottom. So, at age 1, after some initial exposure to language, what you see is sort of a massive upswing in language production in children. And then over time, it still continues to grow in all of us, beyond age 14. I mean, if you didn't know the word asymptote, like I didn't know the word asymptote 2 months ago, you don't have 100% language mastery. None of us do. We're always learning language. So it's always growing. There is no asymptote. By contrast, and it's worth noting that with bilingual and monolingual kids, language is a big differentiator in terms of literacy outcomes. That you see broad differences in language proficiencies between monolingual and bilingual kids, and also within monolingual and bilingual kids. And though that variability is very predictive of reading and writing outcomes for children. By contrast, the development of word reading, same idea here, mastery on the y-axis, age on the x. Word reading doesn't start developing really until formal reading instruction starts. And that's when you see a big jump in mastery of word reading, between the ages of 6 and 10. But then over time, because words are finite, or at least the alphabet and the sounds it makes are finite, barring atypical development, you see kids hitting asymptote. That is an upper limit on learning. That's what asymptote is. There's no more to learn, so you've hit asymptote. That's not universally true, but 26 letters in the alphabet, 44 sounds. It is a finite word reading, and the alphabetic knowledge, phonemic awareness is a finite principle. And between English learners and monolingual speakers, we don't see differences in developmental trajectories over time. Bilingual kids develop English word reading skills just as readily as native English speakers do. There might be time differences in that development as a function of when you're exposed to learning to read in English, but typically kids are able to crack that code. And then there's this idea of language, culture, and thought. So going back to this idea of external speech, reflecting what kids are thinking and being expressed in language. Also this idea that different languages are related to different ways of thinking. And so this idea of what was called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or more generally, linguistic relativity, is that the way we think influences the way we develop language, or the way our languages develop, and the way our languages develop influence the way we think. It's a chicken or egg kind of question that has confounded particularly anthropologists over time. And that's what Leora Boroditsky is talking about in her TED Talk. And I include that along with those three typical or more traditional perspectives on monolingual language development, just as food for thought. Spanish, for example, is a very gendered language, right? So if anyone who speaks Spanish knows, for example, that luna is la luna, which is feminine, but sun, el sol, is masculine. Why is that? Well, there has to be some sort of thinking, some sort of perspective on the world as related to gender that's being reflected in that language, right? Lots of languages are gendered. English is not, at least so externally gendered as Spanish and other languages like Italian. That's why we have terms like Latinx emerging in English, because the term Latino suggests masculine. And in Spanish, for example, you could have a room of 100 women. If it was just a room of 100 women, any adjective you use would be feminine adjective. But if one man comes into the room and there's 101 people, 100 of whom are women and one of is men, the gender of the adjectives to describe that group of people all of a sudden become masculine. So that speaks to thinking about gender also, or can. So the term Latino reflects that, and thus we start hearing now the term Latinx with an X instead of a O or an A at the end to represent what is a gender neutral term, much like black, white, or Asian, which are gender neutral terms. So language, culture, and thought. The TED Talk is very interesting. It's only 15 minutes long. So I'm going to stop there with this video, and you will be able to next watch the video on second language acquisition, which does relate to this one. Thank you. See you in a minute.